Everything I knew, everything my son confided in me, I shared it with the professionals, and they all knew the dangers he was exposed to, and no one shared it with me. I did all the referrals suggested to me, and no one shared the dangers my exposed to. People, let me tell you, if you refer yourself to social services, they're not going to take your children unless you're doing something wrong, and I did that. Had I not done that, I wouldn't have known the level of affiliation my son was exposed to in school. In school, the next place he's supposed to be safe, outside my household. Outside my fucking house.
Don't let me die. I'm only 15. Those were Daejaun Campbell's words as he lay bleeding on Eglinton Road, calling for his mother while a stranger tried desperately to keep him alive. But here is the part that should make you angry. His mother had already told people he was in danger. She contacted his school. She went to social services. She begged for him to be moved away from the area. She became so desperate that she was willing to give up parental responsibility if that was the only way someone would take her fears seriously. And still, on Sunday, September 22, 2024, her son was chased down and attacked with a machete. The following morning, Daejaun was supposed to return to school. He never made it. Subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories, and tell us in the comments which country you are watching from, because this case raises questions that cannot be brushed aside. Why were 3 teenagers waiting near the route Daejaun was walking? What happened when the knife he was carrying struck a fence and broke? Why did one young man flee using a false name? How did CCTV, phone messages, and an electronic tag expose what happened that evening? And after all 3 teenagers were charged with murder, why was one convicted of murder, another found guilty only of manslaughter, while the third was allowed to walk free? Because Daejaun's death did not begin with the first machete strike. It began when his mother realized her son was slipping into danger, and the people she begged for help failed to reach him in time. Before Daejaun Campbell became another name in a murder trial, he was a 15-year-old student at Woolwich Polytechnic School for Boys. At home, he was Jodian Taylor's son and the older brother of 2 younger boys. His family described him as intelligent, creative, and naturally gifted. He was musically talented, quick with mathematics, and strong in sport. They also remembered the side of him that never appeared in court reports: the playful, witty, and cheeky teenager with the big smile, the loyal friend, and the boy who could be genuinely caring and helpful. Project Lifeline had also been working with Daejaun, trying to support him and steer him towards something safer. And that matters because it is easy to look at the final details of this case, the drugs, the knife, the gang associations, and decide that was all he was. It was not. But neither do these memories erase his later choices. Daejaun was a child whose life had already started moving in a dangerous direction. The people closest to him could see it happening. And according to his mother, that change did not happen quietly. The change started after Daejaun entered secondary school, and Jodian noticed it piece by piece. The boy who had once been open with his family began shutting them out. He became withdrawn. He kept more to himself. He grew secretive about where he was going, who he was meeting, and what he was doing. At times, he no longer wanted to be seen in public with his own family. Then came the aggression. Jodian said Daejaun sometimes turned on his younger brothers, the same boys he had once been protective toward. He also began going missing more often. Each absence gave his mother another reason to believe that people outside the home were gaining control over him. She suspected older individuals had pulled him into criminal activity. And the facts surrounding his death show that Daejaun was no longer standing at the edge of that world. He had become involved in carrying or selling drugs. He carried a knife. On the day he was killed, he reportedly had money and a small quantity of crack cocaine with him. Those details cannot be softened. Daejaun was making dangerous decisions, and those decisions placed him in situations where violence was always close. But he was also 15. That is the part people often ignore when they hear the words drugs, gangs, and knives. A child can be committing offenses and still be used by older people. The adults supplying the drugs, giving instructions, or benefiting from the money can remain hidden, while the child takes the risk, faces the police, and becomes the easiest target for rivals. Investigators never conclusively established who recruited Daejaun, who controlled his movements, or who profited from what he was doing. The adults believed to be behind that activity remained outside the courtroom. Daejaun, meanwhile, became more visible with every mistake. His mother could see that she was losing access to him. She could see the secrecy, the absences, and the danger tightening around his life. And Jodian did not ignore it. She began knocking on every door she believed could help her son.
His behavior changed around year 8. Him being at home, he became withdrawn, and then when he wasn't withdrawn, he was aggressive towards his siblings. The behavior kind of got worse in terms of he's not coming home at the time I've told him to come home, and when I ask him where he is, he would tell me who he's with. Then it escalated to social services, so they suggested, should we do a referral to social services, and I accepted. After his arrest, the assessment social worker arranged a meeting. There were supposed to be about 8 people involved in that meeting. Only his head of year and the assessment social worker turned up. The social worker that Daejaun was assigned didn't appear in that meeting. As things started deteriorating, I know that the school was aware that there's a flaw in their system that monitors attendance and punctuality. And I looked at his attendance and it was all in the red. And I said, I've just checked Daejaun's attendance and it's all in the red. At what point were you guys going to call me in for an intervention? Because now I'm being made aware that when your child doesn't attend school for a period of time, they visit your home, they do welfare checks. I had none of that.
Jodian Taylor was not watching all of this from a distance. She was working long hours, including as a bus driver, while trying to raise her children and keep track of a son who was slipping further away from home. She knew Daejaun was becoming harder to reach, but she did not pretend everything was fine. She raised concerns with his school. She asked for meetings. She contacted social services herself. At one point, according to reporting about the case, she asked Greenwich Council to move Daejaun away from the area because she believed the danger around him had become too serious. And then came the step that shows just how desperate she had become. Jodian reportedly considered surrendering parental responsibility if that was what it would take to have her son removed and placed somewhere safer. Think about what that means. This was not a mother refusing support. This was a mother asking the authorities to step in because she believed she could no longer protect her son on her own. According to Jodian, she was told that Daejaun's circumstances did not meet the required threshold for the intervention she was asking for. But Daejaun kept going missing. Eventually, a social worker was assigned. That should have been the moment when everyone involved sat down, shared what they knew, and created a plan before the situation became worse. Instead, reporting connected to the BBC investigation stated that 2 important meetings intended to develop a safety plan were missed. Jodian also said she sent an urgent email and received no response until she followed up herself. Then came one of the most painful details in this entire case. After Daejaun had already been killed, a message was reportedly sent proposing another meeting. The Safeguarding Review later examined the involvement of the agencies that had known Daejaun and the way concerns about his safety had been handled. But by then, his mother had already experienced the outcome she had been trying to prevent. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. Jodian had identified the danger. She had contacted the school. She had gone to social services. She had asked for relocation. She had even considered giving up parental responsibility if that would save her child. She was not asking anyone to excuse Daejaun's behavior. She was asking them to help stop it before it killed him. Then, just as Jodian believed her son might finally be ready to return, the danger reached him first. For all the trouble surrounding Daejaun, his family still believed there was a way back. According to the court record, he had told a relative that the life he was living was not worth it. To Jodian, that mattered. It suggested that beneath the secrecy, the drugs and the absences, her son understood where things were heading. She believed he was ready to step away. Daejaun was expected to return to school on Monday, September 23, 2024. That return had already been discussed. It was meant to be a chance to reconnect with something normal. To walk back into Woolwich was expected to return Woolwich Polytechnic School for boys and begin moving in a different direction. But he never reached Monday. On the evening before he was due back, Daejaun was still outside in Woolwich, still carrying the consequences of choices that had already placed him in danger. And while his mother was holding on to the belief that change was still possible, events were already moving against him. This is what makes the timing so cruel. The next morning had represented a possible turning point. Instead, Sunday became the final day of his life. While Daejaun's family was preparing for Monday, 3 teenagers were already together inside a property overlooking the route he would use that evening. By Sunday evening, September 22nd, 2024, 3 teenagers were together at a property on Daejaun Road in Woolwich. They were 17-year-old Imre Dewey, 18-year-old Marco Balaz, and 18-year-old Jacob Loziewicz. Loziewicz had driven the group there, and the property gave them a clear view of a pathway frequently used by young people in the area. Now, this is where the case becomes more complicated. Prosecutors believed the confrontation that followed was probably connected to local gang hostility or drug territory. Police suspected Daejaun may have been supplying drugs in an area linked to another drug line. The court also referred to what happened as a possible G-check, a confrontation used to challenge someone's identity, loyalties, or right to be in a particular area. But the exact motive was never conclusively proven. That distinction matters. The evidence showed who was present and what happened next, but it did not fully answer why Daejaun became the target that evening. What can be said is that he was approaching a route overlooked by the property, while 3 young men were already gathered there, and at least one of them had armed himself before stepping outside. As Daejaun approached the pathway, Dewey and Balaz came out from the property. Their heads and faces were covered. Dewey was carrying a large zombie-style machete. The court record made clear that he had deliberately armed himself with it. At that point, the situation changed instantly. This was no longer a verbal challenge or a tense encounter between teenagers. One of them had arrived armed with a weapon capable of causing devastating injuries. Loziewicz's role must be described carefully. He had driven the group to the property and was present, but he was later acquitted. That verdict does not prove what he knew privately, but it does mean the jury was not satisfied that the prosecution had proved criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Dewey and Balaz, however, moved toward Daejaun. And Daejaun was armed too. But within seconds, the knife he may have believed would protect him became completely useless. The confrontation changed in seconds. Daejaun had a knife, but when he threw or dropped it, the weapon struck a metal fence or railing and broke apart. Whatever protection he thought it offered was gone immediately. The defense later suggested that Daejaun had a second knife. The judge rejected that claim. From that point, the court found that Daejaun was defenseless. He turned and ran. Dewey and Balaz went after him. This is the moment that matters most when people try to reduce the case to 3 armed teenagers. Daejaun had been carrying a weapon, yes. He had entered that evening armed. But once the knife broke and he tried to get away, the situation changed. He was no longer advancing toward anyone. He was fleeing from a teenager carrying a large machete. Dewey still had the weapon, and he used it. Daejaun was chased along Daejaun Road and struck repeatedly. 8 machete injuries were recorded in total. He suffered wounds to his head, hands, arm, thigh, and ankle. Some of the injuries to his hands and arms were consistent with him raising them in an attempt to protect himself. But one strike caused the fatal damage. The machete cut deeply into Daejaun's thigh and severed a major femoral vessel. The wound was so deep that the blade reached his pelvic bone. He began losing blood rapidly. There was no long pause between the chase and the collapse. One moment he was running. The next, his body was failing because a major blood vessel had been cut open. What had begun as a confrontation near a pathway had become a fatal attack in full view of the surrounding street. Balaz did not inflict that fatal wound. The jury did not find that he was the person holding the machete. But it did conclude that he remained with Dewey, encouraged or assisted the attack, and intended that Daejaun suffer significant injury. That legal distinction later became crucial. The jury was not satisfied that Balaz intended murder or really serious harm. Because of that, he was not convicted of murder. He was convicted of manslaughter. So let me ask you this. If someone knowingly accompanies an armed attacker, stays beside him during the assault and supports what is happening, should that person face the same legal responsibility as the one holding the weapon? Tell me what you think in the comments. because in court, the difference between murder and manslaughter depended on what the jury believed Balaz intended. On Eglinton Road, however, that distinction meant nothing to the boy on the ground. Daejaun was 15 years old, badly wounded and losing blood in the street. Dewey and Balaz ran back toward the property. Daejaun was still conscious. He was still calling for help. And he was still asking for his mother. The screams brought people out of their homes. By the time Tasha Collins reached Daejaun, the 15-year-old was on the ground, badly wounded and losing blood fast. The boys who had chased him were gone. What remained was a child fighting to stay alive in the middle of Eglinton Road. Tasha stayed with him while emergency services were called. And then Daejaun said the words that would remain at the center of this case. "Don't let me die, I'm only 15. He called for his mother. There is no need to exaggerate that moment. A boy who had been carrying drugs and a knife only minutes earlier was now frightened, defenseless and asking for the one person he trusted most. Another young person, described in court as Daejaun's supposed friend, was asked to stay. He reportedly left before police arrived because he did not want to become involved. So while Daejaun lay bleeding, a resident who barely knew him remained beside him, and someone considered his friend walked away. The London ambulance service arrived. An air ambulance medical team also attended. They tried to save him, but the machete strike to his thigh had severed a major femoral vessel. The blood loss was too severe. Daejaun died there on Eglinton Road. He never made it home. He never returned to school the next morning. And his mother, who had spent months warning that her son was in danger, would now have to learn that the danger had reached him before help did. While strangers tried to keep Daejaun alive, the young men who had chased him were already concentrating on themselves. After the attack, Dewey and Balaz did not run far. They returned to the nearby property on Eglinton Road and remained there for several hours while Daejaun lay dying outside. But Balaz had another problem. He was already subject to an electronically monitored curfew connected to separate drug allegations. He needed to get home before the deadline, and he needed to do it without drawing attention to where he had been. So he booked a taxi using a false name. He also arranged for the driver to collect him away from the property rather than directly outside it. Balaz then returned home before the curfew cut off, apparently hoping that being inside on time would help distance him from what had happened earlier that evening. Dewey focused on removing anything that could connect him to the attack. According to the court record, he obtained help disposing of his phone, his blood-stained clothing, and the machete. He changed what he was wearing and acquired another phone. The murder weapon was never recovered. Balaz also recorded images connected to the scene. Those images would later form part of a much wider body of evidence, showing what he knew and how he behaved after Daejaun had been attacked. Their actions were not the actions of teenagers calmly waiting to explain themselves. A false name was used. A pickup point was moved. Clothing was removed. A phone disappeared. The machete vanished. And both young men returned to their separate routines while a family was being told that Daejaun was dead. But in trying to erase the evidence, they had overlooked several things. Eglinton Road had cameras. Balaz was wearing an electronic tag. And their phones had already recorded far more than either of them appeared to realize.
But let me also add, I wasn't a parent that was complicit in my son's behavior. I went through his phone, I searched his room. He never took a knife from my household. However, on the day he was murdered, he had a knife. His fingerprints wasn't found on that knife. Let me just put that out there. But as evidence from his phone, he was provided with knives outside my household. And everything I knew, I shared with the professionals that I referred myself to. I referred myself. This should not be the result of it. And we all need to stand up, because for someone to take these perpetrators to the scene, provided them with a lookout, and also provided them with shelter after the act, knowing what they did, he should not be able to walk free. He should never be able to walk free.
All three young men were charged with murder, but by the time the trial began, their accounts had already pulled in different directions. Imri Dewey admitted that he had the machete. He admitted stabbing Daejaun, but he told the court that he acted in self-defense and that no one else had joined him in the attack. That claim immediately raised a serious problem. Daejaun's knife had already struck the metal fence and broken. He had turned away. He was running. The defense argued that Daejaun had another knife, but the judge rejected that claim. So the jury had to decide whether Dewey was protecting himself, as he said, or whether he chased down a boy who was already trying to escape. Marco Balaz admitted he was there, but denied taking part in the killing. Jacob Woolwich also accepted that he had been present, while denying any involvement in the violence. For 6 weeks, the Old Bailey heard the evidence. The movements from the property, the chase, the broken knife, the machete attack, the electronic tag, the phone searches, the messages, the blood evidence, and what each defendant did afterward. Dewey's insistence that he acted alone did not automatically clear the others. The jury still had to decide whether either of them had encouraged, assisted, or shared responsibility for what happened. Then came the wait. On July 30th, 2025, after more than 19 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdicts. Dewey was found guilty of murder. Balaz was cleared of murder but convicted of manslaughter. Woolwich was acquitted. Now, the difference between those verdicts came down to what the jury believed each defendant intended and did. In Balaz's case, the jury concluded that he had encouraged or assisted the violence. But it was not certain that he intended Daejaun to be killed or to suffer really serious injury. That doubt prevented a murder conviction. Woolwich's acquittal must also be stated exactly as it was. The jury was not satisfied that the prosecution had proved criminal responsibility against him beyond reasonable doubt. So 3 young men entered court facing the same murder charge. 1 left with a murder conviction, 1 left with manslaughter, and 1 walked free. But the verdicts were not the final shock in this case. When sentencing began, the court heard about earlier knife offenses, drug allegations, and warnings surrounding the young men involved. Those histories raised another question. How many chances had already existed to interrupt the violence before Daejaun died? The violence on Eglinton Road had not come without warning.
This should not be the end result. Daejaun was from a good home. It may not have a dad in it, but I was a present parent. I was on the ball with everything. I shared everything with the professionals. This should not be the end result. And just let me share with you guys, the same professionals that I went to because my son's behavior changed within my home are the same professionals that were in charge of the main perpetrator after he did this. He stabbed someone the year before. He chopped someone in the forehead with a machete the year before. He's been going in and out of prison since the age of 13 for knife crime or carrying a knife. Let me just put it out there because they ain't gonna shut me up.
The sentencing hearing made one thing clear. The violence on Eglinton Road did not come from nowhere. Imre Dewey told the court that he had been carrying knives, including machetes, since he was about 13 years old. By the time Daejaun was killed, Dewey already had previous knife possession offenses on his record. One involved a large cookery. He was also serving a youth rehabilitation order for machete possession and a fray when he chased Daejaun and used another blade against him. That history matters because Dewey had already come into contact with the justice system over the same kind of weapon that would later take Daejaun's life. The court also heard that Dewey himself had previously been recognized as a victim of child criminal exploitation. That provided important context for how he may have entered this world so young, but it did not excuse what he did. Being exploited can help explain how a child becomes surrounded by violence. It does not remove responsibility when that child later becomes the person causing it. Marco Balaz also had warning signs around him. He had 2 previous convictions for possessing knives. At the time Daejaun was killed, he was on bail over allegations involving the supply of cocaine, heroin, and cannabis. Police had previously found him with more than 500 pounds in cash, cannabis, 17 wraps of crack cocaine, additional cocaine, and several packages of heroin. Evidence from his phone indicated that he had been advertising drugs for sale. Balaz was also subject to an electronically monitored curfew when he went to Eglinton Road. During sentencing, the judge considered his learning disability, very low intellectual functioning, immaturity, and susceptibility to negative influence. Those factors reduced his responsibility to some degree, but the court still found that he knowingly supported an armed attacker during a planned confrontation. On October 6, 2025, Dewey was detained at His Majesty's pleasure, the youth equivalent of a life sentence. He must serve a minimum term of 21 years before he can even be considered for parole, with time already spent on remand deducted. That does not mean he will automatically be released after 21 years. A parole decision will depend on whether he is still considered dangerous. Balaz received 9 years for manslaughter. Additional consecutive sentences for his drug offenses brought his total sentence to 11 years before the relevant deductions were applied. The court had now delivered punishment. But for Daejaun Taylor, those sentences answered only one part of what had happened to her son.
Murder trial. I'm disappointed, to say the least. The main perpetrator got convicted of murder. His accomplice got convicted of manslaughter. And the person who drove them to the location gave them a lookout spot, and also, after the incident, provided them shelter and a change of clothes, gets to walk home happily ever after. Something which Daejaun will never get the opportunity to do.
The sentences were finally handed down, but Daejaun Taylor was not standing there believing justice had answered everything. She called the young men responsible for her son's death cowards, and she made no attempt to hide her anger at what she saw as a complete lack of remorse. That anger became even sharper because Marco Balaz had been recorded during custody calls apparently boasting about his role. The judge said those calls caused Daejaun even more distress. But Daejaun's anger was not directed only at the people in court. She had spent months warning that Daejaun was in danger. She had contacted his school, social services, and the council. She had asked for him to be moved. She had even considered giving up parental responsibility if that was the only way someone would act. And after all of that, her son was still the one who ended up dead. The verdicts punished the men in court, but they did not identify every person who had failed him. What also remained unanswered was the question of who had pulled him into drug activity in the first place. No adult was prosecuted for allegedly grooming or controlling Daejaun. The teenagers carrying the drugs, the knives, and the risk were visible. The people believed to be benefiting from them were not. Then came another loss. Daejaun's close friend, 14-year-old Kellyanne Bacasa, posted a musical tribute to him. 4 months later, Kellyanne was also killed in a separate machete attack on a bus in Woolwich. The two murders were not prosecuted as directly connected, but both boys had been described as children affected by criminal exploitation. In February 2026, BBC Panorama returned to Daejaun's case and examined Daejaun's warnings and the safeguarding opportunities she said had been missed. Then, on July 21, 2026, the Greenwich Safeguarding Children Partnership announced the publication of an independent local child safeguarding practice review. It examined the agencies involved in Daejaun's life and made 9 recommendations. But none of those recommendations could give Daejaun back the Monday her son never reached. Daejaun was supposed to return to school on September 23, 2024. Instead, his mother was left confronting the teenagers who killed him and the institutions she believed had failed to protect him. Do you believe the warning signs were treated with enough urgency? Share your view below. Subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories, and share this video so Daejaun's story is not reduced to another headline. He was 15. He died calling for his mother. And long before that final moment, adults had already been told that he was in danger.